Your expert is Adam Jortner, professor of history at Auburn University. He has written and lectured extensively on the history of religion and democracy and the history of the imagination. His books include The Gods of Prophetstown, Blood from the Sky, and A Promised Land.
George Washington thought his army would dissolve on January 1st, 1776. And to a large extent, it did. Most of the soldiers who joined Washington's army at its creation in June 1775 only enlisted through the end of the year. On January 1st, 1776, thousands of enlistments would be over, and those soldiers would head home. Washington did not have thousands of soldiers to spare. Washington's army was besieging Boston on January 1st because the British government in London had suspended the right of free elections there, appointed a military governor, and occupied the city with troops. Boston's residents had protested the 1773 Tea Act, which regulated the sale and distribution of tea in all the colonies. Boston patriots had illegally dumped thousands of pounds of tea into the Boston harbor in December 1773, rather than let the new law be implemented. In response, Parliament placed the colony under military rule in 1774. And so, 1774 became a year of division among colonists, between loyalists who supported Parliament and patriots who didn't. In April 1775, protests turned into gunfire at Lexington and Concord. In June, Washington got the call to lead an unofficial army in an unofficial rebellion. Most Americans know July 4th, 1776, as our country's birthday. But the War for Independence started in 1775. And the actual events that caused the fighting, Britain's decision to cancel elections and representative government in one colony, Massachusetts, happened in 1774. When 1776 began, Washington thought it would be the end of his army. Not a birthday, but a funeral. 1776 became a red-letter year across the world. Not just the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, but new governments in Korea, Poland, Hawaii, and a massive Islamic caliphate in West Africa. A smallpox epidemic, two masterpieces of British thought, The Wealth of Nations and The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Not to mention the first commercial use of James Watt's steam engine and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. These worldwide events are not coincidences. They are connections that explained why 1776 turned out the way it did, and why Americans talk about the spirit of 76 and not the spirit of 74. To understand why, we need to pull the camera back and look at Washington's troops and Britain's autocracy in Boston in a wider context. Washington had sent troops into a colony that had not rebelled, Quebec, to stop British reinforcements. But the British routed the Americans outside Quebec City and then hounded them out of Canada by May 1776. As part of that defense, the British governor met with a delegation from the Siouan nations, led by the Mdewakanton Dakota leader Wabasha, opening trade through Quebec to the Great Plains. Subsequent agreements would end up providing the Lakota Nation with additional firepower to complete their domination of the Ojibwe and other tribes of the continental center. The Lakota refounded their empire at the Black Hills in 1776 to take control of all military and commercial activity on the plains, including the highly lucrative fur trade. Reduced access to the fur trade increased pressure for Parliament to find new trade routes. So in 1776, Parliament sent James Cook on a voyage to the Pacific to find the fabled Northwest Passage. Cook never found the Northwest Passage. It doesn't exist. But he did encounter Hawaii and a new source of furs among the Nuu-Chah-Nulth nations of what is now Vancouver Island, Canada. Trade drove imperial economics of 1776. While Cook claimed to discover places like Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest, he did not control their trade. Hawaii soon unified under Kamehameha the Great and began its own history as a Pacific trading port. Meanwhile, control of the fur trade on the northern Pacific coast of North America fell to the Nuu-Chah-Nulth, who connected their American trade networks to China. In the 1770s, China needed nothing from Europeans, but they did develop a partiality for Pacific otter skins, demand for which potentially made the Nuu-Chah-Nulth the richest people on Earth at the end of the 18th century. European vessels were the middlemen in a new world of Pacific trade. European vessels shipped the furs into China through one city, Guangzhou. Ships carrying furs could only stop in Guangzhou because the Qing Emperor of China said so, and his empire was the largest and most powerful in the world. Britain dealt with China through the East India Company, a corporation created to serve the state in a system known as mercantilism. A philosopher in Edinburgh named Adam Smith hated it and championed a system called capitalism in response, also in 1776. Back to Asia. The East India Company used its profits from the China trade to hire private armies to conquer India, where it ran huge plantations with forced labor. Hyder Ali, the Sultan of Mysore, launched a counterattack against the East India Company. The war, coupled with a massive drop in tea prices, bankrupted the East India Company. A number of people in Parliament in London owned stock in the East India Company, so they prepared to bail the company out with something called the Tea Act, which of course led to a rebellion in Boston. The world of 1776 was already globalizing. The American Revolution did not cause everything that happened that year, but Washington's dilemma in January 1776 was connected by politics, fashion, philosophy, and economics across what is now England, Scotland, China, India, Canada, France, Polynesia, and South Dakota. To say nothing of the connections that also existed in Senegal, Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, Mexico, Poland, Bolivia, and Transylvania, all of which we'll discuss in this course. We need to be ready to see that world, not our own. We know the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, also in 1776, but they did not make paintings of American soldiers leaving the army while it was still besieging British-occupied Boston, which is what happened on January 1st, 1776. Even the geography was different. The Atlantic colonies of 1776 would have been unrecognizable to us today. The forests were filled with elm trees, almost all of which were wiped out in 1928 by a disease imported from the Netherlands. The skies were filled with passenger pigeons, a gray and bronze bird that flew in vast flocks, so thick they blocked out the sun. One observer wrote, "The air was literally filled with pigeons. The light of noonday was obscured as by an eclipse. The dung fell in spots, not unlike melting flakes of snow. And when a hawk came, the flock mounted perpendicularly so as to resemble a vast column, which then resembled the coils of a gigantic serpent." Those flocks are now extinct. The last wild sighting was in 1898. Not to mention the other species now rare or extinct in the eastern U.S. wolves, mountain lions, elk, bears, wild chickens. Most British colonists lived within 30 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. Most connections went east to Europe, not to other colonies or west to the Appalachians. There was white settlement further west, but by and large, there were almost no roads. The roads for colonists were the seas, the shipping lanes across to London, the center of the British Empire. It was the nature of that empire, as much as anything else, that put Boston under martial law and had Washington and his fragmentary army there in response. In medieval Europe, virtually every nation that emerged had both a king and a parliament, a monarch who ruled alongside an assembly of nobles. In the 17th and 18th century, almost every European nation experienced a struggle for power between monarch and parliament. Only in England did Parliament win, and established for itself certain ideas about the rights of a king's subjects. England was certainly not a kingdom with any kind of equality, but its 17th century civil wars resulted in a government with an informal arrangement that held that the Parliament made the laws and the king enforced the laws. And since Parliament was, to some extent, elected, that meant that in Britain, the people helped choose those who made the laws they lived under. Did everyone elect members of Parliament? Not even close. Was all of Parliament elected? No, that would be crazy. But at some level, there was a sense in Britain that the government had to connect back to the people of the kingdom. This strange arrangement was referred to by the British as the British Constitution, which was not a written document, but a whole pastiche of different laws, traditions, court decisions, and royal decrees, with ideas about the rights of British subjects mixed in. The ideas and arrangements of rights of British subjects were mostly honored in the breach by British governments, but they were developed, discussed, and debated by thinkers of the Enlightenment, a widespread intellectual and social movement that spread across the world in the 18th century. For the Enlightenment, the individual was the basic constitutive element of political power. As British philosopher John Locke wrote, all men begin in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit. And therefore, the liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent. People were bound to follow the laws of the government, but they had to consent to the government that made those laws. This was the famous idea of a social contract, a theoretical notion that a government is agreed to by all the people under it. Of course, this was an imaginary concept. No one actually gives consent to a government they are born into. But the other prevailing idea of politics in 18th century Europe was also completely theoretical: the great chain of being. The great chain of being predated the Enlightenment by centuries. It was an idea that justified kings, aristocrats, and all kinds of gradations in society. Everything in the universe, from God down to the lowliest worm, could be ranked in order of power and importance. First came God. Under God, the king. Under the king, nobles. And so forth down the European social ladder to artisans, peasants, slaves, domestic animals, and whatever was at the bottom, probably cockroaches. The great chain of being did not just say that God made kings, it said that God ranked kings and everything else in the universe. And therefore, the concept of equality was farcical. This theory of government had no room for consent of any kind. Spain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia all had governments of this type. For Enlightenment thinkers, this kind of authority was known as arbitrary power. Arbitrary power referred to any concentration of political authority that could act without limits. British kings had to consult Parliament, who could limit royal action. Absolute monarchs, the kind that existed in France and Spain, could wield their power without consulting anyone. The question was not whether their actions were good or bad, but that they were done without consent. Their power was arbitrary. The protest against arbitrary power didn't center on the rights of political minorities, nor was it about people being able to do whatever they wanted. As patriot Josiah Quincy wrote, "Liberty does not consist in living without all restraint." Arbitrary power was dangerous because it allowed the few to undo the work of elected majorities. As the pamphleteer James Berg wrote, "Tyranny is nothing else but the government of one man or a few over many, against their inclination." To American patriots, power was only legitimate when those who were governed had some say in how it was exercised, even if that say was not very much. Patriots did not object to the idea of a tax. It was not that each person had a veto over every decision of the government. Nor was it true that anyone who didn't like a law did not have to obey it. Rather, it was that the patriots had no representation in Parliament. Indeed, they did not even see Parliament as their legislature. They thought the colonial legislatures in Boston and Philadelphia and Williamsburg were their legislatures. Since these legislatures alone had representatives whom the colonists had elected, they alone had the right to levy taxes. These were the governments colonists elected, and therefore the government they consented to. Elections and laws held at the pleasure of the king were not a government by contract. They were arbitrary power. This was the heart of the trouble about tea. The Tea Act of 1773 actually reduced the overall tax on tea, but it also regulated the sale of tea in the colonies. Who, when, where, and how much? Thomas Jefferson wrote that the acts had no power, not because they were unjust, but because the government of Britain had no right to legislate for Massachusetts. The true ground on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. The case against arbitrary power became central to the Patriot cause, as evidenced by the words of Charity Clark, an American woman who, in 1769, wrote, "If you English folks won't give us the liberty we ask, I will gather a number of ladies and retire beyond the reach of arbitrary power, clothed with the work of our hands." Arbitrary power was an idea from Enlightenment philosophy, but it was not just for the Locks and Jeffersons of the world. It was also coming from the pens of people like Charity Clark. The Patriots' struggle against arbitrary power began with a British victory. In 1754, France and Britain entered the 7 Years' War, a war of empire known in the U.S. as the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War actually began in North America as a military standoff in Ohio that exploded into World War. North American colonists supported the conflict decisively. In 1759, Samuel Cooper told the Massachusetts House of Representatives that King George has long since founded his empire in the hearts of his subjects. A year later, a Bostonian said that every man he knew would risk his life and property to serve King George III. Before it was over, British forces would fight the Spanish in the Philippines, the Cherokee in South Carolina, the Germans in Europe, an army of rebelling slaves in Jamaica, and the French in Canada, Bengal, the high seas, and almost anywhere else they encountered them. Yet somehow, Britain won, and won decisively. They did so by spending money they did not have and shipping troops all over the world. In the North American colonies, regular British troops met their colonial brethren for the first time. The Redcoats were not impressed. The president of the British Board of Trade referred to the mismanagement and squabbling of the colonial legislatures as the lethargic insensibility of the colonies. Britain had won, humiliated arch-rival France, and plunged itself into deep debt. At war's end, Britain had military forces stationed in North America from Georgia to Hudson's Bay. They occupied Cuba, the Philippines, and parts of India, in addition to the huge navy on every ocean in the world. What would they do with it? How would they pay for it? To balance the books and take advantage of their new imperial holdings in North America, Parliament slapped new taxes on the colonies and made plans to station tens of thousands of troops there. British colonists in the New World were virtually untaxed by Britain, and it was the colonies that had benefited from British military protection in the 7 Years' War. One member of Parliament said, "If America looks to Great Britain for protection, she must enable us to protect her." These taxes included the hated Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed every piece of paper sold in the colonies. The Stamp Act resulted in such widespread protests and non-compliance across the colonies that Parliament called it off. Opponents of the act issued torrents of praise for Britain and King George III. Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem, "To the King's Most Excellent Majesty," on his repealing the American Stamp Act. It read in part, "How shall we the British King reward? Rule thou in peace, our Father and our Lord." 3 years later came the Townshend duties, which again tried to tax colonial goods, including paint, glass, lead, and tea. In Boston, protests were so effective that London sent troops to restore law and order, or at least to enforce obedience. The subsequent deaths of unarmed protesters at the hands of redcoats created enough of a scandal for Parliament to remove the troops and end most of the Townshend Acts. They left the tax on tea in place as a symbolic assertion that Parliament in London had the right to make binding law throughout the empire. Patriots accepted this tea tax compromise in 1770, and it appeared as though the crisis was at an end. And then the East India Company lost a war in South Asia. The East India Company acted as a de facto government in Bengal, and not a very good one. It lost a war with an Indian sultan, mismanaged a famine, and fell into debt to the point of collapse. They needed Parliament to bail them out. Parliament therefore passed the Tea Act of 1773. The act changed the rules about the sale and distribution of tea in the colonies to generate revenue for the EIC bailout. It also reignited the same old argument. Parliament could not make laws for the colonies because no colonial was represented there. In a sense, Parliament chose to protect its empire in India at the expense of its empire in America. A number of patriots marched to the docks in Boston in December 1773 and dumped thousands of pounds of tea into the harbor. When the colonies in America attacked the tea, Parliament decreed retaliatory measures. The port of Boston would be closed and elective offices suspended until such time as the Patriots repaid the EIC for the tea. Which is to say, the struggle that sparked the revolution at some level really was a struggle between democracy and autocracy. Were the Patriots fully committed to the idea of democracy? Did they think everyone had the right to vote? No. So we'll try to be very careful with the way we use those words in this course. But the revolution was fundamentally about the question of whether people had a role to play in their own government, against the idea that those granted with power may do anything to achieve their ends, or, as the Patriots called it, arbitrary power. It was a struggle about democracy. It was the choice of king and parliament to abrogate those governments, to suspend elected legislatures, to arrest and remove elected officials, to refuse trials in the colonies that made the difference. The group tasked with enforcing local patriot rule against parliamentary supremacy was the Continental Congress, intended as a means to coordinate responses, boycotts, and protests. By May 1775, the Continental Congress found itself overseeing a war. In June, they created Washington's army. But even in 1775, Congress waffled. Pennsylvania's John Dickinson suggested that the colonies pay for the tea. In July 1775, under Dickinson's leadership, Congress sent what became known as the Olive Branch Petition. It blamed Parliament for undermining the love that ought to exist between sovereign and subject. Outside the Congress, other patriots groaned at the delay. Mercy Otis Warren wrote to the Patriot leadership, "You should no longer piddle at the threshold. It is time to leap into the theater to unlock the bars and open every gate." The dithering may well have been part of the reason Congress approved such short enlistments when it created its army in 1775. 7 months later, in January 1776, the question could no longer be put off. The enlistments ended, and thousands of American troops simply left. Nathanael Greene estimated his brigade was down to 1/4 strength. Washington and other generals worked desperately to recruit new soldiers. They succeeded in part by reversing Washington's earlier policy and allowing free black men to serve in the army. George III realized the Americans were in rebellion, even if the Americans did not. Indeed, what is curious about the first few months of 1776 is how, across the American colonies, two separate governments coexisted. While Dickinson stood by the lawful nature of the British government, there were places where its rule had already vanished. In Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, British governors fled. By May, it became clear to Congress that the situation was desperate. The collapse at Quebec had become a rout. British forces prepared to march south and split the colonies open. On May 15th, John Adams, writing on behalf of Congress, informed the states, "It appears absolutely irreconcilable to reason and good conscience for the people of these colonies now to take the oaths and affirmations necessary for the support of any government under the Crown. And therefore, the exercise of every kind of authority under the said Crown should be totally suppressed, and all the powers of government exerted under the authority of the people of the colonies." In other words, we're out. Make yourself a new constitution and a new government. And yet May 15th is not Independence Day. There was one more thing for the Congress to do, one thing they could not do as colonists: appeal for international allies. The Patriots knew they could not defeat Britain on their own, and indeed, they did not defeat Britain on their own. At the court of Versailles, the French king showed some interest in helping internal enemies of his arch-rival Britain. France would not risk interfering in an internal British squabble. But if the Americans were no longer part of Britain, if they were a distinct nation, then France could recognize that nation and ally with them. In that sense, independence was a strategic concern for the war. Therefore, Congress had Jefferson write a declaration to the world, one that explained the causes and aims of this rebellion, especially the part about becoming free and independent. Thus, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Jefferson's first line announced to Britain and France that the Americans are now a separate entity. But Jefferson also threw something new in there. It is not 13 states leaving, but rather a people dissolving the political bands which have connected them with another. Jefferson turned his explanation of geopolitical power into an explanation of the ideals that had caused the rift in the first place. That each person has certain rights, and governments must recognize and abide by those rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Jefferson did not need to put this part in there, but he did. In this formulation, rights do not come from the king. They do not come from the social contract. They do not come from history or bloodlines or wealth or membership in a church. They come from being a person. Yes, Jefferson wrote man, and he definitely meant white man, but stay with me. Each person, by virtue of being born, has these rights. They are unalienable, an old-timey word which means cannot be separated. Rights are inherent in personhood and cannot be separated from the human being. King George had closed the legislatures, imposed laws, and fired weapons on his own subjects. That violated consent. And so the United States are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And he threw this in there for the French. As free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, and contract alliances. On July 4th, Congress approved and signed the document and printed hundreds of copies. Americans did not declare independence and then fight a war. They were fighting a war and then declared independence. The Declaration did not begin the revolution. It was a strategy adopted in 1776 for a revolution that began a year earlier. The Declaration did not end the war. It did not end the problems of recruitment in the army. It did not transform everyone fighting for the Patriots into a good people. It did create the United States, begin the process of an alliance with France that saved the revolution, and set out a statement of principles about humans and government that has transformed the world. 1776 would be a year to remember for the Declaration alone. And yet, as we've seen, that was not the only change going on in the world in that year. And virtually all of these things eventually came to transform the revolution and vice versa. Pulling our lens outward to see the global reach of 1776 makes both the revolution and the rest of the world clearer. The Mowatsit of Canada, engineers in Scotland, the religious scholars of Futaturo, and even vampire hunters in Transylvania did not care about the American Revolution, but their lives were changed by the forces of enlightenment, commerce, and empire that came to a head in 1776. Our story begins with an uprising against the East India Company, one that took place in what is now Bangladesh. How a war in India made the American Revolution is next.